Hello, I'm Andy Sharp. Today I thought I'd talk a little bit about leatherworking tools. So specifically the sort of tools that you can cheap out on, the sort of tools that you should spend a little bit of money on, and I'll cover kits a little bit as well. So I'm a sort of intermediate hobbyist level leather crafter. I'm not a professional leather worker, which means that my advice might not be as qualified as somebody who's been doing it for longer, but I haven't that long been. It wasn't that long ago that I was getting my first tools, so I've built up enough experience. I think that I know what matters to a beginner, that perhaps might not matter to somebody who's a bit more experienced. So I'm going to start off with kits. So leatherworking kits are a tricky one. I'm not going to say that all cheap eBay kits are bad, but I don't necessarily think they're a good idea for a couple of reasons. Reason number one is that they tend to have overinflated numbers. So they'll say, 42-piece leatherworking kit, something like that, and it'll count each individual needle as a number, or each individual colour of thread, something like that, each individual piece of hardware even. It can be pretty misleading as to what they're actually selling you. A lot of the time as well, these numbers are filled by duplicates of things, so they'll give you, say, an overstitch wheel. In case you don't know what that is, that's for marking, it sort of rolls around, marking holes in leather. And they'll also give you a stitching punch, and they kind of do the same thing. I wouldn't use an overstitch wheel with a stitching punch myself. And I don't think many people would, so you don't really need the two to get together. So you're kind of wasting your money by getting everything that they bundle in those kits. I think when thinking about kits, it depends whether you have money or time. Some of us unfortunately have neither, but I think if you've got money but no time, a kit from a good repeatable supplier. I've done a separate video about leather suppliers, but especially I think Artisan Leather from that list do a good leatherworking kit that's full of things that you don't necessarily immediately grow out of, that decent quality things. And I wouldn't recommend going for the really cheap stuff if you've got money, because you get what you pay for. It's going to fall apart. You're going to need to buy it again anyway, so probably not a good idea. Conversely, if you've got time but no money, I recommend you shop around, you go second hand. I've had some fantastic deals on eBay for second hand leather tools, especially if you're in the USA. The market, I think, is much better than over here. Figure out what you need tool by tool. Ian Atkinson made a wonderful tool list that I'll link below. Use that resource. Use Reddit. The Leathercraft subreddit on there is fantastic. Use YouTube, preferably me, but I haven't made a lot of content yet. Figure out what you need and shop around a bit. So the first thing I think you should immediately cheap out on is an edge slicker. So what these are is one of those. So the little wooden thing that they use to smooth down edges, especially of veg tan leather, and it's a piece of wood. The cheap ones work exactly as well as the expensive ones. For a couple of quid, you can have something that you will use for your entire leatherworking career and will not wear out. Some people, I imagine, will extol the virtues of gourmet woods, ebony ones, or cocobolo, I think, is another wood they use, but these things do the job. In a similar vein to the edge slicker is the bone folder. So that's the sort of thing that you'd use to stretch out your pockets of a wallet you were making, or just to finish. It's just great as a finishing tool for leather. It's not necessary, but I think it really does improve the fit and finish, especially of something like a wallet, if you do go around it with a bone folder. Traditionally they're made out of rib bone, but nowadays that costs a little bit more. The cheap plastic ones do exactly the same thing. They're not going to wear out. Nice rounded corners. Job done. The third thing I think you should probably not spend all of your money on is thread snips. These ones from eBay, these little ones, come in packs of multiple units. I think I paid £1 for these, possibly less than £1. They do the job. Yes, they might not sharpen as well as something else, but to be honest, I'm quite impressed with the fit and finish of this, actually. It said it was solid brass. I'm not sure I believe it, but it doesn't matter. It does the job. So number 4 is a tooling setup. So to clarify, I don't mean the sort of complex tooling you might see from really great sort of professional leather workers, where they're doing custom designs, leaf patterns, floral designs. I mean the type of thing where you're stamping a design into leather using predetermined shapes. So as an example, that is an example of what I'm talking about. You're going to focus? There we are. So that's a butterfly example of what I mean. that sort of thing. The cheap ones seem to use the same supplier that some of the bigger brands sell, and they do the job, don't they? They're not going to wear out. So number 5 is rivet and eyelet setters. For me, as long as you get the right sort of size, it's going to do a reasonable job. So to show what I mean, that's a rivet setter for saddlery copper rivets, which I got for no money at all, and that's one for doing what's that for doing? Snaps. That's for doing a certain size of snaps. As long as you get the right size, you probably should be okay with them. So I don't think you should spend all your money on those, because the proper ones are quite expensive. Number 6 is a stitching pony. To be honest, it's not actually necessarily something that you need. A lot of people, for example, Quarter Leather, don't actually use a stitching pony, and I didn't for a long time. But I did find when I got one, it did improve my stitching. And it's not actually a huge amount of cost. So this one is, I mean, it looks ugly as all hell, but I made it because I made it myself. But it cost me, I think, £8, £10, and that was only for the hardware. I didn't have the bolts. If you already have some bolts knocking about, some longish bolts, you can make yourself a stitching pony for almost no money at all. I don't think I'm going to do a separate video, but there are some amazing videos on YouTube about making your own stitching ponies. Yeah, with some old scrap wood you've got knocking about. That's ugly, but it does the job. Number 7 is a lump of stone. So what I mean by that is a kind of smooth flat surface that you'll be doing rivets on, or if you're putting stitching chisels through something, obviously you'd have a protective layer on top of it, which I'll come to in a minute. But the actual base, you want something solid that you can hit a hammer on. It's not going to smash. It's not going to bounce off. And for that, a lot of people you see with these really lovely slabs of granite. Some people get them from kitchen supply shops, the sort of place you'd buy a worktop from. They might let you have some offcuts, although some people I think have started charging for this. But what I use is a piece of stone I found in the garden. I think it's off a railway at some point, I'm not sure. But it's very heavy, it's flat. You could use a brick. I actually did use a brick for a while, and it worked pretty well actually. I only switched to this because it's a bit bigger. And you don't need anything fancy. This is kind of optional as well, as if you've got a sort of fairly sturdy workbench. Oh, it's heavy. So number 8 is a cutting mat. So this kind of thing. It's covering up my face. That's a nice thing, isn't it? The sort of thing that you would cut onto, the self-healing type. And this cheap one is doing wonderfully for me. I've gouged some chunks out of it, as you can see with a skiver. I think you might not be able to see that, but with a skiver, it's still nice and smooth. It does self-heal a little bit, but not too much. And they're kind of disposable things. They will wear out eventually, and the cheap ones just do the job as well. It's a recurring theme, that isn't it? Recurring phrase. It does the job. Now the next one is knives. Now some people use Stanley knife. I think they call them box cutters in America for some reason. Possibly because they use them to cut open boxes. They use that type of cheap knife for their entirety of their leatherworking career. Chuck Dorset from Weaver Leathercraft, I think, does that. And if it's sharp, you know how to use it, and it's sort of got enough rigidity that it's not going to sort of bend and flex all over the place. You can use whatever you like, really. I've used a scalpel in the past for cutting out fine shapes. Still do, actually. I've used a penknife, I've used slightly better knives, and to be honest, they all do the same thing. The main issue with cheaper stuff that I personally had was the difficulty in sharpening them. So the next one, I've lost count totally, is a skiving knife. It was in the don't cheap out on category, actually, this type of tool, because it's quite a specific use case for a thing. But actually, and I was recently clued on by Howie Rogers, who I've mentioned before, and who I think I've put this knife in a different video as well, actually, is this skiving knife I got from eBay, which is excellent. It cost me about £4. It came absolutely razor sharp. I'll link it in the description below. And I think there were a few different listings of this type of design on there. And honestly, this thing is excellent. It's for the price. It's solid. Handle's a bit big, but it's really solid. Yeah, you can't go wrong, to be honest. So it's now, for this knife specifically, this category of tool is in the do cheap out on category. So the next thing on the list is awls. The reason why I think you should cheap out on awls is because you can probably make your own if you've got access to any type of grinding equipment, any type of sandpaper. It'll take a lot of work, but you can do it. This is a screwdriver that my grandpa sharpened a few years ago into an awl, and it worked perfectly. Yes, no, it's not pretty, but it's sharp, it does the job, it's sturdy, it's rigid. The blade won't be replaceable, so perhaps you might want to upgrade fairly soon. But yeah, you can make your own. Why not? So the first thing I think you should possibly buy the expensive version soon if you get the cheap version is the letter stamps. So these are the ones I've got from eBay. They are made of a slightly odd metal. They go a bit rusty if they're out in the wet. In this kind of damp shed, they went a bit rusty. And they came covered in machining grease of some sort, and they're okay. They do the job. They're a bit wonky. One of the L, particularly the L letter of mine, is at an angle, so I always have to put the thing at a slightly different angle to the rest of them. The letters generally aren't deep enough, so you end up with a circle indentation of the tool around them. But they do the job. If you're doing something very basic, a few key rings for your friends, if you're mum or something, it'll do the job. And if you can't afford to drop £100 on a proper set, yeah, it's a good alternative. So the second thing I've put on the list is actually the thing you should upgrade first if you're improving your kit. When you're starting out, you're using a metal hammer. I used one that I found on a road for a while, which worked. It works fine, but the trouble is it damages your tools. It does this, so you can see the mushrooming on the edge of that tool where the striking surface is slightly wider than the tool around it. That's if you imagine that it was a good stitching iron, a nice tool that you wanted to look after, that's going to shorten the lifespan of the tool. So a good hammer that's not going to crush the metal, so that's when I got second hand. A rawhide hammer, polyester, polymalls some people like, nylon hammers, something like that that's not going to damage your tools, I think is a fantastic upgrade to make if you're upgrading your kit. So the next thing on the list to upgrade soon is the edge bevelers. So the ones that you can get in cheap eBay kits, yes, they'll work, but they're quite hard to sharpen, I found, because of the shape of them. They don't have a nice flat surface. So this one from Abbey was about £16, and it's got a nice flat surface there. You can see that's sort of polished up, which makes it slightly easier to sharpen. And they come in different sizes. I wouldn't trust the standard sizing on AliExpress or eBay tools personally, whereas you know what this is going to be if you get a good edge beveler. In addition to that, a good handle will give you the ability to get a far smoother line if you're edging a belt or a wallet or something like that. And yeah, they're much better. I'm glad I upgraded mine. So the next thing I would upgrade fairly soon if you've cheaped out is stitching irons. So that's a cheap eBay iron. Yes, it works perfectly well, but it's quite hard to pull out of leather because they're often not sort of polished up. You can polish them up yourselves, but they're also not very nice to hold in the hand. This one has got rather square, rather sharp edges, and it's not very nice to hold in the hand versus one of the better ones like this. This is a KS? I forgot what make this is. It's a good make, but it's got a nice gnarled grip, made of tougher material, more easily polished up to a higher standard. And yeah, it's just all round a nicer tool, and it'll give you a nicer result in a greater variety of different stitch widths as well, I would think. So the next thing actually on the list is to upgrade if you've gone for the cheap version is leather. So bad leather holds you back. I'm not saying start out your first project on shell cordovan because, quite frankly, you're not going to be worthy of the leather. Or your first project will look rubbish, whatever leather you're using. But once you get to a certain point, the sort of problems like if you're using PU leather, which isn't really leather, if you're using awful cheap chrome tan stuff that's not really meant for what you're trying to do with it, that's going to hold you back. So if you go to a decent leather supplier, get a side of something that's perhaps on clearance or something that's they ask them what they'd recommend you learn on. But if you go for really cheap, horrible stuff that's not meant for proper leather work, then you're going to suffer as a result. And similarly to leather is hardware, actually, because this is more of a personal preference thing. But I'm going to make a separate video actually why I like solid brass hardware. And the reason that I've put this in is because the first belt I ever made was a nickel-plated buckle. It looked fantastic to start with, but the nickel plating has now started to come off, so it looks a bit naff. So I think if you're going to once you've got past a certain point, I'd upgrade your hardware to sort of be in line with the leather. Don't use really posh leather with really cheap hardware because that's going to look a bit weird. But don't, if you're using awful scraps of something, perhaps solid brass hardware from Japan isn't the best choice. I think I'd upgrade them both simultaneously in a kind of stepwise thing. So the next version of a tool that I think works better than the cheap ones is rulers, actually. They're not very expensive. To be honest, what you could do is buy a better ruler to start with, but I bought a very cheap one for about £1 that, yes, it works, but it's got quite sharp edges that can mark leather. So perhaps better going for a safety ruler with rubber on it that won't mark your leather, will allow you to get a good grip, perhaps keep your fingers out of the way of knives. Probably a good idea just to go for a better version than me. So the next thing on the list, actually, where I think an upgrade does matter, is hole punches. Now, I wouldn't do this immediately. Do it in a couple of years down the line. I still haven't upgraded my hole punches because I use one that my grandpa gave me that's pretty good, pretty middle ground. And the reason I think the better tools make a difference is that they're, especially for the type where you hammer them in, the standalone one-size punches, the more expensive ones tend to come out of the leather more easily, so you won't be fighting at it and wasting time and energy and sort of knackering your forearm muscles trying to wrestle a punch out of the leather, because they're normally shaped. The cheap ones can be quite a heavy taper, whereas the more expensive ones kind of have a more sort of defined curve to them, or they can do anyway. I think cheap ones as well are going to be harder to sharpen if they're made of a worse steel. They're not going to keep an edge as long. So in a couple of years, perhaps upgrade those. So the next thing that I think cheap stuff really does hold you back actually is thread. I was using really cheap linen thread for a while, and I've found that the difference it made when I upgraded to this is tiger thread, any kind of nice polyester thread, or braided particularly I like, but I think nice proper leatherworking thread makes a huge difference to the quality of your work. It'll look better, it'll be easier to stitch. I've never broken this while stitching, whereas the cheap stuff I broke all the time. This is an upgrade I'd do fairly soon, I reckon. So adding on to the consumables thing that I've started with thread, I'd actually put sandpaper and adhesives there as well, because bad adhesives, your stuff's going to fall apart when you're trying to stitch it, and bad sandpaper, the grit generally comes off, and you get kind of weird discoloration all over your work where the grits come off, I found, with terrible sandpaper. So those two are probably worth upgrading a little bit into your journey. The next item is skivers. I mentioned skivers in the intro when talking about kits, but this is one from, I think it's Abbey or Artisan Leather. This is a kind of, I think of it as a potato peeler style, well, it's not actually a potato peeler. And it works a hell of a lot better than the cheap ones. The cheap ones, I've never found they worked. So if I were you, I wouldn't bother buying them, and I'd just go straight for this. But I put it in this category because some people do get a lot of use from the cheap ones and then only later want to upgrade. But I think it is at some point worth the upgrade. So now we're moving on to the type of tools that I don't think you should ever go for the cheap versions of. Perhaps I've been burnt by them personally, and I'm just still angry at the makers. But the first thing is needles. I had some awful cheap needles that weren't meant for leather, and the difference between them and John James, which I now use, I was going to show them on camera, but they're just too small. It's not going to focus. Get John James. They're a couple of quid for a packet of 25. They're far easier to thread. They're far easier to work with. They break far less often. Just go John James. Don't go for rubbish stuff. The second thing I don't think you should ever get the cheap version of is crew punches. So what these are, I'll show you on camera, is that. So that's the sort of thing that you'd use if you're punching a hole in a belt for a buckle to go in. And this cheap thing is horrendous. All the ones on eBay all look the same as this. It's heavy, it's rusted, it's impossible to sharpen, it doesn't come out of leather. You see the taper on that is very sharp, so I was talking about that earlier on with the other hole punches, but the taper on that is terrible. If you're going to get a crew punch, buy something good. I would actually advise at the start, don't buy one, because what you can do is getting a hole punch of the correct size, mark either side of where you want the buckle to be, and then just cut a small piece in the middle out between the two holes, and that'll give you the same effect as a crew punch. It gives me a far better effect doing that than it does using that cheap thing. I will be upgrading soon. Don't buy the cheap ones. The next thing I don't think you should buy the cheap version of is punching mats. So this sort of red, they're normally red, don't know why they're red, protective stuff that you'll use to protect your tools. So if you're punching through a piece of leather or a wallet, say, into your punch will go into that and it will not get damaged. The reason I say I don't think you should go for the cheap versions is that the cheap versions aren't normally thick enough. This is kind of a cheapish version. The proper professional ones are thicker than this still. They're about, you know, an inch thick or something. And the reason being, if you go through this and go to the bit of stone perhaps on the other side, that knackers your tool and it's going to be a lot of work and possibly have to be replaced. So yeah, for the sake of your tools, protect them with a good bit punching mat. So the last thing on my list, the things that you should buy the full price version, is scratch awls. So I'll just show that to camera. So that's what that is. That's for marking. So marking leather when before you cut it out. So literally making a scratch. That's why it's called a scratch awl. Sometimes called a clicker's awl. The reason I don't think you should cheap out is because the proper versions from a good supplier or from, I mean, even Osborne ones are a couple of quid. And quite frankly, you might as well go for the decent version. They're very useful. I do recommend you get one. But yeah, for a couple of quid, might as well get the good one. So I hope this has been useful. I appreciate that my recommendations, I take them with a grain of salt. I am only an intermediate level hobbyist, but hopefully that's if you're a beginner, that's been a little bit of use for you. If you disagree, if you're another leatherworker and you disagree, please feel free to tell me in the comments. Leatherwork's a very subjective thing. Everyone has different opinions, so I'd love to hear them. Yeah, I hope that's been useful, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.